RTE Radio 1.
I did not know how much then was ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered along the crooked gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud, and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there.
And those were the words of Black Elk from Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in 1890. The tailpiece of one of the greatest works ever written on the story of the struggle of the Native American to retain control of his ancestral lands in the face of the westward expansion of the USA, and our book club choice for March. Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was first published in 1970. It's American history from the Native American perspective, incorporating both eyewitness accounts and historical records. The book is an indictment of the politicians, soldiers, swindlers, adventurers and settlers who colonised the American West. It's the history of the people who got in the way of manifest destiny and paid a high price. Joining me to discuss the book are Colleen Dewby, Executive Director of the Fulbright Commission, former Sunday Tribune US correspondent Marion McKeone, and Dr. Mike Cronin, academic and historian. You're all very, very welcome indeed. Colleen, this is not your first time to read this book, and I think the first time you did read it, it had quite an impact.
It did, and I'm trying to remember, was it in high school or college, but I distinctly remember reading it and getting about 50 pages into it and being reduced to tears, and then determined that I had to get through it. And we were commenting before when we came in, reading it kind of 20 years later, whether it's age, bit of worldly wisdom, it doesn't have that same impact, but it is, even as said in the introduction, not a cheerful book. So I approached it with some sort of trepidation, not sure if I was ready for a tear-induced experience, but I have survived to tell the tale.
Okay. Mike, context very important here. 1970 was when the book was written, and that was in the wake of the struggle for essentially black emancipation, for black civil rights.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the packaging around the book. I mean, it's a compelling story, but it really is emerging from the kind of political consciousness that's emerged from not just civil rights protests against Vietnam, America's relationship with other peoples, and I think it's that kind of looking back to America's treatment. If you think of the United States as its own empire geographically, really what was pushed out the way, what was destroyed in that push to build America. And I think the way that civil rights had demanded an insertion of not just black civil rights, but also the role that blacks had played in the building of America, it's very much this book is trying to kind of reinsert Native Americans into the history of the nation. So it isn't just this kind of single line kind of wash-bish kind of the American story. Yeah. And I think it's also the interesting context. I mean, where the book comes from is that we've discussed before we came in, obviously, in the front of the book there's a map that only covers the western side of the United States, is the way this whole period dovetails with the utter destruction and desolation on the eastern side of the country of the American Civil War, where black soldiers, Native American soldiers are all involved, and again within that history very much have a sort of secondary role.
Yeah, and also being written in the context of the American Indian movement, which is rising up in the 1960s and comes into its own very much in the 1970s. Published 40 years ago, Marion, translated into 17 languages. It has never gone out of print, but it covers a relatively short period of time. It only covers from around 1860 to 1890. Why focus on those years?
I think those years were the years. In fact, I'm just looking around the table here, and we each have an entirely different copy, different edition of the book. So it just shows many times it's been printed, reprinted. I think that really was the end of the Native Americans. That was the period in which I think it's probably the best documented, because I think one of the things that Dee Brown says is that the stories that he tells in that book, a lot of them came from the last survivors or the children of the last survivors. Like they were actually word of mouth stories. So I suppose much before that, he didn't really have a lot of, you were relying very much on written documents. As we know, the quality of written documents was very, very poor, and it was also left open to the interpreters and to the winners to write those. So he went really to the source for his stories, and I think the period that he managed to get the most information about. And I'd say the most direct information was that period. And it's such a, when I was in the States during the 10 years I was there, I spent quite a bit of time on the Indian reservations in Idaho and in South Dakota and indeed down in Arizona. And it's just heartbreaking. I mean, these places are beautiful wastelands. I mean, particularly in Idaho, they're astonishingly beautiful, but there is nothing. You really do get a sense of how bereft these people are and how marginalised they've become. And interestingly, just picking up what you were saying there, when the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 was published, which gave equal rights to all Americans. It said everybody born in America except the Indians. Yeah. And it really shows that from the beginning they were completely, they never were seen as being part of the narrative of American history or of the American. It's very, very, I mean, this book is so dense, and it is that thing of coming back to it after 20 years, having read it previously, that I think my brain was much more agile 20 years ago, because I could then make more sense of the various tribes, the battles, the conflicts. There's such density in this book. It does take quite a read.
But Colleen, the interaction between the Native American and the United States of America, the federal government, the people of America, the settlers, the swindlers, all of this, disastrous from the point of view of the Native American.
It was disastrous, but it was a point that Mike made, and I think just, why this particular period. I think it was an amazingly transitional period in American history, after, and that nexus with the Civil War. You mentioned it yourself, Myles, in the introduction, the manifest destiny in terms of go west, young man or woman. And there were such pressures on the east side in terms of not enough space. We needed to go west in terms of industrialization and settling. But what struck me in rereading the narrative, I suppose the nuances that we now know from American experiences elsewhere, from even looking at Irish experience, that the Native Americans still saw it as their country. There was a number of references in, and I think it was Sitting Bull maybe at the end was saying what they've done to our country, and there was this strange schizophrenia amongst the Native Americans, but they did see America as their America. They saw it as our country in conjunction with the federal government. Many of the Native Americans served as kind of Indian police in that transitional period. And in the book, it's quite hard to kind of follow that a bit. And I suppose we have to read it with an almost modern lens to understand what's happening in current conflicts was happening then, where the Native Americans, to a certain extent, were almost part and parcel in some cases of their own destruction.
Because there were rivalries between individual nations.
The various peoples, and there was a lot of splitting up of peoples, through the treaties and a lot of the movements. So it was a huge amount of intersection between peoples and also the various phases of American development.
Okay, Mike, let's talk about some of the stories in the book, but starting with one, I suppose, a success story, if you like to look at it like that, however brief, from the point of view of the Native American, and this was Red Cloud and Red Cloud's War. Now, the nation, I suppose, that dominates the narrative is the Lakota or the Sioux. Tell us a little bit about the Lakota at the time of this Red Cloud's War, which was in the 1860s.
I'm just thinking, seeing what you're seeing with the Lakota people is similar to a lot of the different chapters as it geographically moves between different peoples and so on, is this constant, the federal government basically looking at a map and deciding that they want the next bit. Suddenly Native Americans discovering that people are arriving, be it the army, be it prospectors, whoever it is, but the idea that commissioners are sent out basically to tell the Lakota, please move, please be on your way, and would have sort of either massively reduced their lands or pushed them even further away.
So the bit of land that you got in the last treaty, we're now taking it away from you.
And that's the amazing thing. I mean, it's just that whole constant mind changing by government because they've got to build a railway or because they've found natural resources, is the way these kind of treaties that are put in place between commissioners and Native American chiefs. And, the pipe of peace is smoked and all those kind of cliches. But the idea then the commissioners come back almost 2 years later and say, oh, it's almost, sorry lads, we've changed our mind. And this kind of sense of frustration. And I think the importance of Red Cloud and his story, his war, is the way that he's somebody who really does kind of stand up to, or successfully stands up to, the American army, to the commissioners, and fights, in modern terms, a kind of war of insurgency. He has very kind of agile, very adept warriors who, we're on the borderland, we're on the frontier here, are using their own skills, they're using the local geography to basically constantly trap and attack the military, to the point where Red Cloud effectively kind of wins his war. There's a kind of a massacre, the sort of Fetterman incident, where there's probably the most profound attack on the American army during this period, where Red Cloud's brought together 2,000 warriors, which is an incredible number of people, and they managed to kill 88 US Army men. The interesting thing again is a kind of this schizophrenia as a propaganda. There is a huge outrage after Fetterman that the story goes on to prove how uncivilized the Native Americans were, the idea they had removed the genitalia of the army men they'd killed and rearranged them. And yet, as D. Brown makes out, this is something the Native Americans have learned from American cavalrymen 2 years earlier, the idea that this kind of brutality is both ways and all ways, and that's the terrible tragedy of it.
Red Cloud managed to get a treaty, another treaty out of the federal government, the
That's
Treaty
right.
of Fort Laramie.
Yeah, he got the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was
1868.
a huge success, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, because it basically said, okay, you know what, we're not going to take this from you. No more white people can come onto your land, onto this, without your permission. And, the amazing thing is that as always, there are two things here. Firstly, I think that the Native Americans, they had a really strong belief that the earth belonged to no one, that America belonged to no person. You couldn't own a part of it. It was an absurdity to them, because you just they were conservationists. They took what they needed and they didn't take the rest, and they couldn't get this treaty thing because, as many of the chiefs said, how can we sell you something that we don't even own? It's not ours to sell. So given that, they still became adept at signing treaties, and so they signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which did in fact give them the right to allow white people onto it. But of course, a treaty with America, with the American government, the federal government, would only last as long as some riches wasn't discovered. So they would give property and land while they thought it was of no use to them, but at the first scent of riches or gold or minerals, and then they were in there and the treaty was torn up. I think that Red Cloud had almost a very sad ending, where he became seen as a quasi-collaborator and a coward by people like Crazy Horse, and then they all ended up together as sort of disenfranchised, and almost there's a very poignant ending to Crazy Horse's life when he sort of blames Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, another they all wanted to live in peace, but there was always a schizophrenia about that. The Indians wanted to live in peace so long as they were left alone to farm their land, and the white people would say, we'll live in peace as long as you let us take whatever we want whenever we wanted. And so hence you had these people who fought with great passion, but who were sort of outskilled, but they did know the terrain. And as you say, Mike, it sort of has been repeated in other countries. Even recently in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, you have these, with the Russian invasion in particular, I was thinking, you have these people who know their country, who know the terrain, who have a way of fighting, and no matter how big an army, no matter how powerful, it has to adapt to that. And it's, history really does repeat itself.
Although they were heavily outnumbered and heavily outgunned.
Colin,
moving on then to somebody who becomes famous for a phrase that he may or may not have said, and somebody with strong Irish connections. General Philip Sheridan, he turned his attention from the Confederates in the Civil War to the Cheyenne and the Sioux and other Native American nations.
Exactly. Supposedly, it was General Sheridan who said the only good Indians I ever saw were dead, which turned into the immortalised phrase that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And as you said, Myles, many names that kind of had started their life in the American Civil War turned their attentions to the Indian Wars, and he famously was involved with battles with demise of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and Black Kettle, Roman Nose, Tall Bull, and particularly Black Kettle. When Black Kettle unfortunately was killed, Sheridan was delighted and rejoiced that they had wiped him out, a worn-out and worthless old cipher. And it was Sheridan who
this was one of Custer's great moments.
Exactly, that's where I was getting to in terms of Sheridan and Custer, who was known affectionately by the Indians as hard backsides Custer, were hand in hand in their I suppose their war on the Indians, and it just became absolutely baffling, to be honest, that their arrogance and, as we were talking about, their inability to understand that the Indians might know the land a little bit better than they do, which led to Custer's last stand, as we all know it, which I'm sure is subject to further discussion.
Come to that now, because Mike mentioned the Fetterman massacre, and that was in 1866. That was kind of the second biggest defeat for the Army of the West. The biggest defeat was at the Little Bighorn River in 1876. But Marion, backtrack a little bit, sketch in the background to that conflict, the invasion of the Black Hills and the importance of the Black Hills of Dakota.
The invasion started as soon as, again, the Black Hills to the Indians was a sacred place. It wasn't about the gold in the hills, and apparently they discovered after there was over $1 billion worth of gold in the hills. But to them it was a sacred place. It was where they went to speak to the spirit gods for when they wanted visions, and so it was way more than just a place that had riches. So they would not. There were a couple of places that they were adamant that they would not give up. That they would. I think, as I think it was Red Cloud said, they would use every last drop. No, in fact it was little big man who said every last drop of warm blood in his body would be spent in protecting these places. But the white people came and they wanted the gold, and so having been told that they wouldn't have to allow anyone in, then the situation was reviewed. Custer came out and brought 1,000 soldiers and said, well, basically arrived at that invitation, and this led to, before the Battle of Little Bighorn, there was a small or little known battle called the Battle of Rosebud, and the reason I'm connecting it is there's a woman, this is all very macho, all this cowboys and Indians and army men and generals and all these guys with names like Three Fingers and Hard Backsides and what have you. So, but there was a woman who sort of straddled both of these battles, which were both big victories and rare victories for the Cheyenne and the Sioux, and her name is Buffalo Calf Road Woman. Now, the Battle of Rosebud was the precursor to Little Bighorn. Basically, it was a sort of what seemed initially to be a skirmish. The General Crook got involved in something which he shouldn't have got involved in. Without going into too much detail, the battle basically sapped his strength, and it sort of meant that he had to retaliate, or he had to, retreat and go back. Therefore, he wasn't ready to go to Little Bighorn at the time of Custer's last stand. Now, the woman, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, was a young Indian squaw in the middle of the Battle of Rosebud, when the Indians thought they were being beaten. The Cheyenne Sioux thought they were being beaten. Her brother was shot off his horse, and she raced in. Her job was to handle the horses. The Indian women did not get involved in battle, although they did do a lot of horse handling for the warriors. So she raced into battle. She got her brother, she pulled him out. It was like one of those things you'd probably see in a Western. Pulled him up off the ground, swung him on the back behind her on her horse, and raced back out again. Now, the Cheyenne were so kind of impressed by this and wowed by this that the battle to them became known afterwards as the Battle of the Woman Who Saved Her Brother, whereas the Americans called it the Battle of the Rosebud. Now, you only have to move forward a week later, which the 24th, I think, of June.
June 1876.
To the Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer had gone up there with his men. There was this fantastic victory for the Cheyenne and the Sioux, who joined forces, who fought together, and there was always this, this battle is legendary. It's been reenacted so many times, but there's always been this mystery about who killed Custer. Now, the Cheyenne never told the story of this until 2005. The Cheyenne just never spoke of the Battle of Little Bighorn. This book was written in 1970, so many people took credit for, it's like who shot JR, many people took credit for who killed Custer, and it turned out that this same woman again raced into battle. She obviously really had the blood up, and she pulled Custer off his horse, thereby allowing several other Indians to come down and to clobber him, and I think he was wounded several times, so many people could take a bit of credit for that. But it was extraordinary to me, in such an absolutely macho, male-dominated world of battle and blood and gore, that this obviously very, very plucky woman was involved in two of the biggest, most significant battles, and apparently had a significant hand in ensuring victory in both battles.
And let it also be acknowledged that the Irish played their part in
and not in a good way.
Yeah, not in a good way at all. Anybody want to elaborate on that one?
Well, it's something that's, once again, reading it 20 years later, now living here, I couldn't help but notice all the Irish derived names, but I mean one in particular who isn't quite mentioned in these accounts, but is Myles, who most famously had fought in the Papal Wars and also was with Custer at Little Bighorn. And quite interesting, it is mentioned in a couple of places in the book that many of Custer's men were known to be singing Gary Owen as they tromped through the fields, and obviously the Irish connections ex-Civil War, those in the Indian Wars, is really kind of everywhere throughout the book.
It was actually played at the Washita Massacre. He had a band with him. Custer had a band with him, the 7th Cavalry Band, and they started playing Garryowen, and their saliva, it was so cold, froze in the instrument. So Garryowen disappeared basically after about 10 or 20 seconds. A couple of it's a very interesting text actually coming in. Liam says there was a man from Glencar named Fitzgerald, and he wrote a book, Leaving Glencar. He lived in the United States with the Indians, and their chief at the time was Red Cloud. Liam knows of the existence of only one copy of this book. I'd love to find out where that one copy is. In Knocknagoshel in County Kerry, apparently there used to be a pub called the Wounded Knee. It was called this because the owner, Joseph O'Connor, used to sing the song Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Bury it so deep that I will not feel the white man walking over me. He says it was a lovely song, and he also says it was a great pub to get a pint after hours. That's neither here nor there, I'm sure. Probably the one book everyone should read, not to be anti-American, but as a lesson to defend what you have and never trust those in power just because they say the right thing, is another reaction. Okay, to finish off with Wounded Knee itself, with the so-called Battle of Wounded Knee. The prelude to the Battle of Wounded Knee, Mike, was something called the Ghost Dance, and this was a very religious movement, or a very religious experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sad thing about as you go through the book is just clearly you understand, you look at the geography, the numbers of Native Americans just diminishing and diminishing, and being moved and moved and moved. And it almost seems as if it is it's almost a wake before the inevitable, in the sense of the way that the this sort of dance of the ghost kind of moves through, that different groups are trying to move across the continent, trying to kind of find their way, and that's the sad thing when you get to kind of Wounded Knee, is the idea that the terrible incident that comes from Wounded Knee is just somebody trying to move from A to B. And happens upon the American forces, and I think it's also that whole idea of the ghost dance as well. I think it's a period where that ending period, sort of late 1880s, is a real, military. We are talking about a 30-year period. Military technology's moved on. I think that's one thing that kind of really strikes you towards the end is these battles are, they're not bare fights anymore. It's kind of really shifted through. So I think that end period is really this. I don't want to use the word wake, but it's not really.
What struck me with the ghost dance is
we're up to 1890 now.
Despite everything that the Indians have been through, they still just had a profound sense of belief that they were going to get through this, and then the whole ghost dance was equivalent to what happened in other parts of America, whether the Quaker movement, the Awakenings, the Seventh-day Adventists, that people were looking for some divine intervention, and it was Indians basically dancing in religious fervour and hope, and there was this concern that no one knew what to make of it, that it was all going to be lead to more fighting. And there was an interesting voice of reason at the time, Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy said the coming of the troops has frightened the Indians. If it was the Seventh-day Adventists, we'd let them be put in motion. Why can't the Indians have the same privilege? So it was the Indians trying to salvage something of their spirit, of their homeland, in terms of looking to a certain extent for a messiah, as it was called.
You get this at Wounded Knee. I mean, the sort of as the Native Americans are kind of squaring off with the soldiers, the idea that nobody makes a complaint. Only the medicine man Yellowbird makes any overt protest. He danced a few ghost dance steps and chanted one of the holy songs, assuring warriors that the soldiers' bullets could not penetrate their sacred garments. The bullets will not go toward you, he chanted in Sioux. The prairie is large and the bullets will not go toward you. And it's just kind of, desperate
that was a
clinging.
belief, wasn't it? Yeah. I think with Sitting Bull, when he had the sun dance before that, he believed when he saw the visions of, as he saw soldiers falling out of the skies, I think he said like grasshoppers, and indeed it did happen quite soon thereafter. But I think they had a belief, the Native Americans, that you would go into, and I think this was especially espoused by Crazy Horse, that this is a shadow world. So all the bad things that were happening to them, the way their land was being taken, their buffalo were being killed, their people were being starved, that this was all a shadow world, and that you could, with the help of these dances and trances, go into what they call the real world, which was essentially, I suppose we would see it as a dream world, and thereby find a solution to problems in the shadow world.
But I just, Myles, you mentioned that this was a battle. I mean, in reading reading it, to be honest.
It's a massacre.
It's a massacre. In that everybody, a gun went off, and all of a sudden
there were, I think, 25 members of the U.S. Army actually killed in the fight.
Yes, but 300 out of 350 Indians were
five of whom, by the way, were Irish. Just as
you also wonder with the kind of American Army guys that were killed, it probably put down to a friendly fire incident in these days. I mean,
most of them were injured by their own shrapnel.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Question from M. Murphy and Carlo: is D. Brown male or female? D. Brown is very definitely male. And somebody else says Gary Owen remains the march of the US 7th Cavalry, as I think does another Irish song, The Girl I Left Behind Me. And Pat Smith says the 2007 film adaptation for TV of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was a superb and stark piece of work which won several awards.
Starring Irishman
Aidan Quinn, indeed.
Yeah.
Mike Cronin, Colleen Dooby and Marion McKeone. Thank you very much indeed. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown is published by Holt, and there are many, many different incarnations of this book. Back after the break.
RTE Radio 1.